The archive is open. Come in out of the cold, your chair is where you left it, the one by the lamp. Tonight I have taken down a familiar word from the shelf. It is cut into weathered timber in many retellings, surrounded by an abandoned settlement and treated as the entrance to a mystery. We will arrive at that word in time, but not yet. You do not need to remember any of this. There is no test at the end. If you drift, I will keep reading. Let us begin before the carving, before the English houses, and before an Atlantic sail appeared beyond the barrier islands. Roanoke Island lies between the ocean and the broad, shallow sounds of the coast, now called North Carolina. Water gathers around marsh grass and low wooded ground. Inlets shift, sandbars move. A boat that draws little water can pass where a deep ship cannot. Wind changes the surface quickly, and a storm can revise a shoreline. The English newcomers did not enter an empty landscape. They entered a region they recorded as Osamokamuk, inhabited by communities whose towns, fields, fishing places, paths, political relationships, and seasonal knowledge had been built over generations. The National Park Service describes Carolina Algonquian peoples as having lived along the Outer Banks for at least 800 years before the English reconnaissance of 1584. Carolina Algonquian is a broad modern term for peoples connected by related languages and regional patterns. It does not name one centralized nation. CROATOAN, Roanoke, CROATOAN, and other communities had their own towns, leaders, interests, and relationships. Their histories cannot be folded into a single supporting role in an English story. The empty settlement that later confronted John White was an English settlement. That distinction matters. Houses built by colonists could be dismantled or reclaimed by weather, while indigenous life continued around the Sounds. A missing English group did not make the country vacant before or afterward. The surviving evidence is uneven. English accounts tell us much about English plans and anxieties. John White's drawings and Thomas Harriot's descriptions preserve valuable observations, but each came through a colonial project and a foreign eye. Archaeology can recover a well, a fragment of pottery, a workshop floor, or disturbed soil. It cannot make every object identify the person who last touched it. So the rule for tonight is simple. We will say what the record supports, name uncertainty when it remains, and resist the wish to make one clue carry an entire conclusion. Roanoke did not fail in one secret night. It was a sequence of attempts dependent on water, food, repair, diplomacy, finance, and reliable return voyages. Several of those systems were weak from the beginning. Others were damaged by English decisions. Here is the first detail to carry with you. Before any English post stood in the clearing, a narrow path already reached the water. Feet had pressed it firm between trees and marsh. At its end, a small boat rested above the tide line, ready for work that belonged to a known and inhabited shore. To understand the coast, begin with movement that did not mean wandering without a home. Carolina Algonquian communities lived in towns and used a wide landscape through the seasons. Fields near settlements produced maize, beans, and squash. Rivers, sounds, marshes, forests, and the ocean supplied fish, shellfish, waterfowl, deer, plants, wood, reeds, and clay. Different work came due at different times, and knowledge lay in knowing when and where to do it. A town connected houses, storage, cultivated ground, landing places, and paths. Houses were built from local materials and required maintenance like any dwelling. Poles formed a frame. Bark mats or other coverings kept out weather. Fires warmed interiors and supported cooking. Baskets, pots, nets, tools, and food stores turned a structure into a household. English viewers often arranged what they saw into categories useful to England: resources, commodities, rulers, defences, and land that might support a colony. John White drew towns such as Roanoke and CROATOAN with careful attention to houses, fields, gathering places, and activities. Thomas Harriot described crops, fishing, plants, and materials. Their records are among the richest surviving European observations from the first voyages. They are not neutral windows. White selected a viewpoint and composed a scene. Harriot translated unfamiliar practices into English words and colonial possibilities. Engravings made later in Europe altered some details again. The people represented did not control how their homes would be copied, titled, circulated, or used to attract investment. Even so, the images resist the old fiction of an untouched wilderness. Fields are ordered. Houses stand in relation to one another. People cook, fish, gather, dance, speak, and work. The landscape bears the marks of knowledge. Political life also crossed the water. Towns could be linked under influential leaders while retaining local identities. Alliances, rivalries, kinship, trade, and recent conflicts shaped how any visitor was received. English writers frequently simplified leadership into the titles they expected to find. Local authority was more relational than a label on an English map could show. The community of CROATOAN lived south of Roanoke Island, associated with the place now called Hatteras Island. Roanoke was connected to Roanoke Island and nearby territory. CROATOAN communities occupied lands to the west and south across the Sounds. Names and boundaries in English records vary, and the record is incomplete, but the distinctions were real enough to affect diplomacy and danger. Travel among these places required intimate knowledge of weather and water. A shallow canoe or small boat could move through sounds where an Atlantic vessel risked grounding. Fishing grounds changed with season and tide. A channel safe last year might have shifted. A landing exposed to one wind could be protected from another. Food security depended on work accumulated over months. A field represented clearing, planting, tending, guarding, harvesting, drying, and storage. Stored maize was not an unused surplus waiting for strangers. It carried households through lean periods and preserved seed for another planting. When English groups later demanded or took food, they drew from planned reserves whose owners understood their limits. Disease made the imbalance more severe. Pathogens carried through Atlantic contact could spread among people without prior exposure. English observers noted deaths, but did not understand infection as modern medicine does. Illness could weaken a town, reduce labor, unsettle authority, and turn the arrival of visitors into a remembered danger. The English would depend on this regional system while repeatedly misunderstanding it. They needed guides, interpreters, pilots, information, and food. Yet dependence did not reliably produce restraint. It could produce suspicion and force when supplies ran low. For now, remain with the town before those pressures tightened. Smoke rises through an opening in a roof, fish dry on a rack. Beyond the houses, broad leaves stand in cultivated rows. At the landing, someone pushes a narrow boat into shallow water and knows, without a written chart, where the channel bends. In 1584, the first English voyage, associated with Walter Raleigh, came to observe rather than establish a permanent settlement. Philip Amadas and Arthur Barlow commanded the reconnaissance. Their task was practical and political. England sought a foothold in North America from which privateering, trade, territorial claims, and future settlement might grow. The voyage had to locate harbors, evaluate land and resources, meet inhabitants, and return with a report persuasive enough to support another expedition. The coast did not offer an easy harbor for large ships. The expedition entered through the Barrier Islands and explored the Sounds. English descriptions praised fertile land and generous abundance. Promotional writing rewarded optimism. A report intended to sustain investment naturally emphasized possibility more than the daily cost of maintaining hundreds of people across an ocean. Meetings with local communities brought exchange as well as observation. Food, hides, metal objects, and other goods moved between hands. Each side judged the other through limited language and uncertain intentions. Hospitality was not permission for permanent occupation. Trade was not agreement about sovereignty. When the ships returned to England, 2 men from the region traveled with them, Manteo, associated with Croatoan, and Voyage, associated with Roanoke. English accounts place them at the center of the knowledge gathered for the next voyage. They learned English, encountered court and city life, and supplied words and information that Harriet studied. They should not be reduced to assistants in Raleigh's project. Both had crossed into a foreign political world whose plans concerned their homes. Each observed England as surely as England observed him. Their journeys may have involved curiosity, diplomacy, pressure, calculation, or several motives together. The surviving English record does not allow a complete account from either man's perspective. Their later choices were not identical. Manteo maintained a working relationship with the English and served repeatedly as interpreter and intermediary. Voyage became strongly opposed to English settlement. Treating one as loyal and the other as hostile merely repeats the colonists' categories. Their positions can instead be understood as political responses to what they learned and to what the English did after returning. In England, information became preparation. Harriet worked on the Algonquian language. Planners considered routes, resources, town locations, and regional relationships. Maps translated local geography into a form useful to ships and investors. None of that preparation removed dependence on the people who knew the coast directly. An English map could mark an inlet, yet a local pilot knew what wind made it dangerous. A word list could record a noun, yet an interpreter had to recognize intention, rank, warning, and insult. A report could praise maize, yet only a community that had planted and stored it could decide whether food was available to share. The 1584 voyage, therefore, returned with 2 different kinds of cargo. There were descriptions designed to encourage English action, and there was human knowledge carried by Manteo and Voyage, knowledge that could not be separated from their own judgments about the project forming around them. The next expedition would be much larger. It would bring soldiers, specialists, tools, weapons, and expectations. It would also bring a plan built partly on an inviting report from a short visit during a favorable season. Here is the detail to carry onward. On a table in England, a sheet of paper holds a coastal outline. Beside it lies a growing list of unfamiliar words. The marks look still and manageable. Across the room, two men who know the actual sounds listen to plans being made for a country the planners have barely seen. The outer banks look narrow on a map. From a ship's deck, they form a long uncertainty between ocean and sound. Barrier islands are made and remade by water. Sand moves along the coast. Inlets open, close, and migrate. Shoals extend beneath a surface that may give little warning of depth. A storm can alter the route by which a vessel entered only a season earlier. Large Atlantic ships needed room beneath their hulls and space to turn. They carried people, guns, rigging, tools, food, spare materials, and smaller boats, but their depth made them poorly suited to much of the sound. The ship that crossed the ocean could not simply sail to every intended landing. Pilots approached by stages. Sail was shortened. Lookouts watched for breakers and changes in water color. A sounding line measured depth. Anchors held a ship outside danger, while pinnaces, boats, and canoes carried people and cargo through shallower passages. Every transfer multiplied work. A barrel lowered over a ship's side had to remain dry, balanced, and secured in a smaller craft. Then it had to cross exposed water, reach a landing, and be moved again. Iron tools could tolerate a splash better than meal or powder. Livestock, if carried, introduced their own disorder. A rising wind could stop the entire chain. The coast also separated shelter from access. A protected sound might offer calmer water, but require passage through a difficult inlet. An ocean anchorage kept a deep vessel outside, but exposed it to weather. Roanoke Island stood within the sounds, useful for small craft and regional travel, yet awkward for dependable supply by an Atlantic fleet. Local knowledge therefore mattered at every turn. People who traveled these waters knew channels through repeated use, not from one survey. They read tide, wind, current, season, and the behavior of birds and waves. English charts could preserve a route after someone showed it, but no ink kept a sandbar still. The mismatch shaped colonial time. A ship could arrive off the coast and still be days from unloading. Exploration consumed provisions while boats searched for passages. A grounded vessel risked hull damage. A lost anchor or broken mast could narrow all later choices. When weather threatened, commanders had to choose between cargo, schedule, and the safety of the fleet. English plans often treated the coast as a threshold to be crossed on the way to settlement. In practice, the threshold remained present. Every letter home, replacement tool, barrel of grain, and returning person had to pass through it again. This is one reason the later carving cannot be separated from boats. If the 1,587 colonists relocated, their movement depended on craft fit for the sounds and on people who knew a destination. If rescuers hoped to follow, they needed weather, time, and a vessel able to approach. A place name might indicate where to look without making the passage possible. Here is the detail to carry with you. A sailor lowers a lead weight over the side. The line slips through his hand until it touches bottom. He calls the depth. The ship advances a little, then waits for another measurement, while beyond it, the low green shore seems close enough to reach on foot. The expedition of 1585 was no quiet household migration. 7 vessels carried roughly 600 soldiers and sailors under a plan for reconnaissance, defense, and colonial occupation. Ralph Lane would govern the group left in the region. Richard Grenville commanded at sea. Specialists included Thomas Harriot, John White, and Joachim Gans. Manteo and Wanchese returned as men whose knowledge and political judgments had become central to the English project. Before a settlement could be built, the fleet suffered a basic loss. The Tiger, Grenville's principal ship, grounded while entering through the Barrier Islands. Seawater damaged or destroyed much of the food cargo. A colony intended to rely on carried provisions began with its reserve sharply reduced. The loss compressed every later decision. Food determines how many people can remain, how far they can travel, and how long they can wait for a harvest. It determines whether skilled labor builds shelter or searches for supplies. A damaged barrel is not a small inconvenience when its replacement is across an ocean. Grenville eventually departed, leaving Lane with about 100 men. The exact arrangements changed through the venture, but the character of the settlement was clear. It was a military colony without women or family households, expected to explore, assess resources, and establish an English position. On Roanoke Island, the men repaired or razed dwellings and built an earthen fortification. Timber had to be cut and shaped. Earth had to be moved. Roofs, walls, doors, hearths, beds, storage, and drainage required attention. Salt air, insects, heat, and rain worked continuously against materials and bodies. Nearby, scientific and industrial work left traces later recovered by archaeology. Harriot observed plants, language, geography, and resources. White drew people, towns, animals, and coastlines. Gans tested ores and materials for signs of valuable metals. A workshop required charcoal, controlled heat, clay, crucibles, tools, water, and repeated trials. This was practical work, but it served colonial extraction. The English were not studying the region only to understand it. They wanted to know what could support settlement, enrich investors, strengthen England, or justify another voyage. Daily survival competed with those goals. The damaged provisions could not be restored by a promising essay. A map did not plant maize. Soldiers trained for conflict were not automatically skilled farmers in an unfamiliar climate. The colony depended increasingly on food obtained from nearby communities and on information carried through Manteo and other intermediaries. The fort offered protection from an attack, but not from hunger, disease, or isolation. Its walls could also deepen suspicion. To local communities, armed strangers had established a defended base, traveled through surrounding territory, and expected continued assistance after arriving in large numbers. English discipline did not remove internal strain. Command disputes, illness, rationing, and uncertain resupply shaped the settlement. Exploration parties consumed food and depended on boats. Men sent away from the main camp were harder to support. Every task drew from the same reduced store of labor and provisions. At night, the colony was less an emblem on a map than a collection of unfinished obligations. A roof leaked. Powder had to remain dry, a tool edge dulled. Someone tended the fire beneath a small furnace. Someone counted what remained in the food store and knew the number would be lower by morning. Here is the detail to carry onward. Inside the earthwork, a cooper turns a damaged barrel toward the light. Saltwater has reached the grain between its staves. He tightens one iron hoop, though the food already lost cannot be repaired with the container. John White worked in water and pigment. Thomas Harriot worked in notes, measurements, and language. Joachim Gans worked with heat, ore, and residue. Their methods differed, but all three converted a living region into evidence an English audience could carry home. White's surviving drawings preserve clothing, tools, fishing methods, plants, animals, ceremonies, towns, and faces observed during the voyages. Some are careful studies. Others arrange several activities into a composed view. Watercolor allows detail and color that later black and white engravings changed when the images were published in Europe. The drawings matter because so much indigenous material culture from the period was made from wood, fiber, bark, hide, and other materials less likely to survive in the ground. A painted object may preserve a form archaeology no longer holds, yet the image also preserves White's selection, where he stood, what he considered worth recording, and how he organized what he saw. Harriot learned enough of the local language to communicate and compile observations. He described food plants, medicinal resources, minerals, animals, and social practices. His account challenged some exaggerated fears circulating in England, but it was also written to explain the country's usefulness to colonization. Translation introduced choices. One word could be made to fit an English category that did not carry the same boundaries. A leader could become a king. A town could become a possession. A cultivated landscape could be described as available land. Information could be accurate in detail and still arranged toward an unjust conclusion. Gans's workshop pursued another colonial hope: profitable metal. Archaeological work at Fort Raleigh has identified evidence associated with scientific and metallurgical activity, including furnace materials and objects connected to testing. The quiet labor involved crushing a sample, preparing charcoal, controlling a small furnace, separating residue, and deciding whether a trace justified further investment. Negative results were information too, though they were less useful to promotion. A sample without valuable metal narrowed expectation. A failed firing revealed something about clay, fuel, or temperature. Colonial planning advanced through disappointments as well as discoveries. Maps combined observation with intended control. Coastlines, inlets, rivers, and towns became marks that could guide a later vessel or support a territorial claim. Blank space did not mean unused space. It often meant the mapmaker had not observed, understood, or chosen to record what was there. These records now serve purposes their makers did not foresee. Historians compare versions. Conservators examine pigment and paper. Archaeologists test drawings against soil and shoreline. Descendant communities read images made under colonial conditions for traces of ancestors whose own accounts were not preserved in the same archives. No single source is transparent. English writers disagreed, defended themselves, sought patrons, and wrote after events. Drawings were copied. Maps were patched. Objects moved through later layers of soil. Evidence becomes stronger when different forms meet without being forced to say more than they can. The discipline required here is not distrust of every record. It is attention to how a record was made. Here is the detail to carry with you. White rinses a brush in a small vessel. On the page, the line of a house wall dries beside a cultivated field. Beyond the paper stands the actual town, full of names, conversations, and obligations that no view from one seated observer can contain. By the winter of 1585 and 1586, the colony's most important relationship was not with a distant investor. It was with the communities whose food kept the English alive. The Tiger's damaged cargo had shortened the margin from the beginning. English planting could not immediately replace it. Crops require suitable seed, knowledge, labor, weather, and time. Men sent to explore rivers or search for resources were not tending fields at Roanoke. The colony therefore sought maize and other provisions from nearby towns. Exchange could support both sides when terms remained acceptable, but English need grew larger than an occasional trade. Stored food represented a community's winter reserve and next season's seed. Giving it away could transfer hunger from the newcomers to the people who had produced it. Disease deepened fear and loss. Algonquian communities experienced severe illness after contact with the English. Harriet observed that disease sometimes followed English visits, though neither side understood microbes or immunity. People could see the pattern without knowing the mechanism. Strangers arrived, and afterward many residents became sick. Such deaths were not a convenient opening for settlement. They were losses of parents, children, leaders, farmers, fishers, healers, interpreters, and accumulated knowledge. A town weakened by illness had fewer hands for planting and harvest, just as armed colonists pressed for supplies. Wingina, an influential Roanoke leader whom the English later called Pemisapan, initially engaged with the newcomers. His position changed as the colony's demands, movements, and violence changed the political landscape. English accounts portray plots against Lane, but those accounts were written from within the colony and often served to justify its actions. Lane dispersed groups of men, in part to find food and expand English knowledge. Distance made them vulnerable and extended pressure across more communities. Reports traveled through interpreters and messengers. Rumor and strategy became difficult to separate. Each side had reason to expect the other might act first. English violence had already made the danger plain. During the voyage, Grenville's men burned the CROATOAN town of Aquascogoc after accusing residents of taking a silver cup. The punishment destroyed homes and food over an object. It showed how quickly the newcomers could answer uncertainty with collective retaliation. By the spring of 1586, trust around Roanoke had sharply deteriorated. Lane believed Wingina was organizing resistance and withholding food. Wingina had reason to see the colony as a growing armed threat. The English were hungry, isolated, and waiting for supply. The people around them were facing disease, demands, and intrusion. Lane chose an attack. In June, English men killed Wingina and beheaded him. The act was deliberate political violence, not an accident produced by an unknowable wilderness. It removed a leader while making any stable food relationships still less likely. Soon afterward, Francis Drake's fleet arrived from the Caribbean. Drake offered assistance, including ships and supplies, that might have allowed Lane to continue. Then a hurricane struck, weather scattered vessels and damaged the arrangement. With provisions uncertain and relations around Roanoke broken, Lane's colonists accepted passage back to England. Their departure was hurried enough that materials and men connected with later English plans became confused. A small group left by Grenville afterward would not provide a stable bridge to the next colony. The first sustained attempt had ended, but English promotion did not end with it. Harriet's published account later emphasized the country's resources and possibilities. White's images presented ordered towns and useful plants. Raleigh's venture still required investment and royal support. Failure could be described as a correctable problem rather than a warning about the project itself. Yet the lesson was already severe. A colony that could not feed itself had converted dependence into coercion. Military strength could seize a meal or kill an opponent. It could not compel a field to produce before harvest, restore people lost to disease, or rebuild trust after retaliation. Here is the detail to carry onward. In a storehouse, only a shallow layer of maize remains at the bottom of a basket. Each kernel can be eaten now or planted later, but not both. Outside, spring rain touches a field whose harvest is still months away. The next English group carried a different social plan. In 1587, roughly 118 men, women, and children crossed the Atlantic under John White as governor. The presence of families suggested something beyond a temporary military base. Households might plant, build, raise children, and establish a civilian colony intended to persist. Their intended destination was not Roanoke Island. The plan pointed toward the Chesapeake Bay region, where deeper water and a different strategic position seemed more promising. Roanoke was to be a stop, a place to check on the small English group believed to have remained after the earlier venture, and perhaps recover useful materials. The fleet's pilot, Simon Fernandez, refused to carry the colonists farther. English accounts disagree around motives and blame, but the practical result is clear. On July 22, the group landed at Roanoke, in the same strained landscape the military colony had left. They found no functioning English settlement waiting for them. The earlier dwellings had suffered from abandonment and weather. One body was reportedly found, and the small holding force was absent. Whatever continuity planners expected had failed. The colonists began repairing houses and building again. This work was not symbolic. A family needed a roof before the next hard rain, a dry place for bedding and food, and a hearth that did not fill the room with smoke. Doors and shutters mattered when relations nearby were uncertain. Wells and landing places mattered every day. Household cargo differed from military equipment. Clothing had to last. Cooking vessels, bedding, seed, carpentry tools, and personal goods had to survive repeated unloading. A lost chest could remove everything one family expected to use for years. A damaged tool might have no replacement on the island. The calendar was against them. Landing in late July left limited time to establish crops before colder months. The colonists inherited neither a dependable English harvest nor a repaired alliance capable of feeding them. The violence of Lane's colony had not disappeared when his ships sailed away. Manteo again served as interpreter and intermediary. The English named him Lord of Roanoke and Chesapeake in a ceremony that expressed English ideas of title and reward. The title could not give him uncontested authority over other communities. His relationship with CROATOAN offered a connection, but no one man could erase the region's recent losses. Voyage, meanwhile, remained opposed to the English. His judgment after traveling to England had placed him on a different political course. The contrast between the two men reveals no simple division between friendship and hostility. It reveals choices made under colonial pressure, with consequences neither could fully control. The colonists had arrived expecting to continue north. Instead, they were repairing an abandoned site beside shallow water, late in the growing season, with uncertain food and damaged local relationships. Families made the settlement more durable in intention, but also increased the number and variety of needs that supply had to meet. At evening, domestic work gave the place a different sound from Lane's camp. A pot stood near a hearth. Cloth was shaken free of sand. A child slept while a wall was still being patched. Someone sorted seed and wondered which portion could safely be planted. Here is the detail to carry with you. A carpenter fits an old board into a repaired doorway. The wood bears marks from the colony before this one. He planes one edge until it closes, making a temporary house on an island that was never meant to be the journey's end. The surviving record gives the 1,587 colony only a brief season before John White sailed away. Within that season, ordinary time continued. Meals had to be prepared, water had to be carried, watches had to be kept. Clothing required mending, tools required sharpening, and children required care. A settlement does not become less domestic because danger stands beyond it. The colonists rebuilt gardens and dwellings, but late summer offered no instant reserve. They still needed exchange and information from neighboring communities. Manteo helped renew contact with CROATOAN, whose people had maintained a more cooperative relationship with him and with parts of the English venture. Elsewhere, the situation remained dangerous. George Howe was killed while alone, reportedly searching for crabs near the water. His death frightened the colony and intensified demands for a response. The English believed men from Chesapeake were responsible. They planned a retaliatory attack with Manteo's assistance, but the village they approached had been abandoned by its usual residents, and CROATOAN people were there gathering food left in the fields. In the darkness and confusion, the English attacked their own allies by mistake. The episode exposed the weakness of violence as a substitute for knowledge. The colonists could organize armed men and cross the water. They could not reliably identify who occupied the village before striking. An alliance already carrying heavy demands now had to absorb English harm. Domestic life continued beside that failure. On August 18, Elena Dare, John White's daughter, gave birth to a daughter named Virginia. The child was baptized, as was another infant born to the colony. English accounts made Virginia Dare the first English child born in the settlement, and later memory turned her into a symbol far larger than the short record of her life. Here she belongs first within a household. Birth required privacy, water, cloth, warmth, assistance, rest, and food. Elena Dare was a woman recovering from labor in a settlement with uncertain provisions. Virginia was an infant who needed feeding and protection. Neither existed to decorate a future mystery. Religious observance gave the English language for belonging and endurance. Baptism entered names into a Christian record and made a ceremony of community continuity. It did not solve the practical conditions around the font. The colony still lacked a dependable supply schedule, a secure harvest, and broad local trust. The colonists pressed White to return to England for help. He was reluctant to leave his family and concerned that his departure might later be interpreted as abandonment. The settlers gave written testimony that they had asked him to go. Their decision shows agency rather than passive disappearance. They assessed their position and sent their governor toward the system most likely to bring supplies. Before he left, the group discussed movement. White later reported that the colonists intended to relocate about 50 miles into the mainland and that they would carve the name of their destination if they left Roanoke. They also agreed on an added sign if departure occurred under distress. These plans matter because they show that an empty site was possible without a sudden catastrophe. The colony was not bound to remain beside the repaired houses. Small boats, regional knowledge, and alliances could support relocation. But the record does not preserve exactly who moved whether the group divided as discussed, or what happened afterward. White departed in late August. Behind him remained his daughter, granddaughter, and a settlement entering autumn. Ahead lay an Atlantic crossing, investors, ships, war preparations, and delay. Here is the detail to carry onward. In a repaired house, a cradle rests near the wall. Beside it, a small bundle of tools has been tied for travel. One belongs to staying, the other belongs to leaving. For the moment, both wait in the same quiet room. John White reached England, expecting to organize a return within months. The voyage back to Roanoke instead became entangled in a European war. England and Spain were moving toward open conflict. Ships, sailors, weapons, and provisions were claimed for national defense. Private owners also saw profit in raiding enemy commerce. A small colonial supply mission had to compete with the Spanish Armada, government restrictions, privateering, and the priorities of investors who had already spent heavily. White did not simply forget the colonists. He worked through a system that could not produce a dependable ship for them. Raleigh's authority and money were not unlimited. A vessel required owners, crew, victuals, cargo, weapons, insurance against loss, and official permission. Every participant could calculate that a voyage to Roanoke offered less immediate return than an armed cruise against Spanish shipping. Colonial finance was a chain of promises. Investors paid before any harvest or trade returned value. A lost ship could erase years of capital. News traveled at the speed of the same vessels being risked. By the time one report reached London, conditions at Roanoke had already changed. The settlers needed a repeating supply system, but Raleigh's venture still operated as a succession of difficult expeditions. In 1588, White secured two small vessels for an attempted relief. Their size limited the supplies they could carry. The captains pursued privateering along the way, and both ships were damaged in encounters at sea. The expedition returned to England without reaching the colony. The failure turned one winter into another year. Across the ocean, the colonists had no way to know which obstacle held their relief. A delayed ship could mean weather, war, loss, changed orders, or abandonment. Waiting itself consumed food and narrowed choices. The group had already discussed moving. That plan now becomes more important than the repaired houses White left behind. A settlement closer to reliable food, friendly relations, or the intended mainland destination might be safer than remaining on Roanoke. Dividing into smaller groups could reduce pressure on one place, though it could also separate labor and defense. Any movement required decisions the surviving archive does not record. What could be carried in boats? What must be left? Whether dwellings would be dismantled for useful timber and iron? Which community might receive newcomers? How English households would negotiate residence in land already governed and used by others? CROATOAN was not an empty refuge. It was the home of Mantio's community. If some colonists went there, their survival would have depended on consent, exchange, kinship, labor, and political circumstances that cannot be recovered from a single English word. Movement toward the mainland would have created different relationships and risks. By 1590, White finally obtained passage with a privateering voyage. The ships were not under his full command, and the colony was not their only purpose. He traveled as a man trying to reach family within a commercial venture whose commanders still controlled schedule and risk. Nearly 3 years had passed since his departure. An infant could now walk. A repaired roof could fail. Seed could produce several harvests or none. Alliances could deepen, break, or be remade. The settlers White hoped to find would not be suspended in the August afternoon when he last saw them. The delay is often treated as empty space before the mystery resumes. It was not empty for the people living through it. It contained weather, work, illness, births, deaths, negotiations, travel, and decisions. The problem is that their record no longer reaches us with White's ship. Here is the detail to carry with you. In an English harbor, a barrel marked for the colony waits beneath a canvas cover. Warships are being fitted nearby. Orders change, sailors move to other decks, and rain gathers in the seams. The barrel remains on the quay while another tide rises and falls. On August 18, 1590, John White reached Roanoke Island again. It was his granddaughter's 3rd birthday. The approach was difficult. Men crossed rough water in boats, and lives were lost before the search properly began. Darkness, weather, and surf shaped what the party could inspect and how long it could remain. They saw a fire in the distance and hoped it might signal the colonists. They sounded a trumpet and sang English songs, listening for an answer. None came. The fire proved to be unattended grass or brush rather than a message from the settlement. At the site, White found no English households waiting. The houses had been taken down rather than left standing in ruins. The area was enclosed with a substantial palisade. Heavy objects and supplies had been buried and later disturbed. White's own chests, containing books, pictures, and armor, had been spoiled. On one tree he saw the letters CRO. On a post at the entrance to the enclosure, the word CROATOAN had been carved. White remembered the agreement that the colonists would leave the name of their destination if they moved. He also remembered the planned distress mark. He reported that no such sign accompanied the carving. The dismantled houses and orderly indications therefore suggested to him that the departure had been deliberate rather than a hurried flight. This is the strongest immediate meaning of the word. It told White where the colonists intended him to look, or where at least some of them had gone. CROATOAN was a known place and community, not a supernatural cipher. Mantio's people lived there, south of Roanoke. The word does not tell us what happened after it was cut. It does not identify every person who traveled. It does not establish that the full colony remained together, that everyone arrived safely, or that a later relationship took one particular form. A destination can be evidence without being a conclusion. White wanted to sail to CROATOAN. Weather and the condition of the ships prevented it. Anchors were lost, the vessels were driven away, and the commanders chose not to risk another attempt. The Voyage left the coast without completing the short journey that might have answered White's most urgent question. He never returned. The search therefore stops at an especially frustrating distance. The name was present, the intended place was known, yet the people with the ship, the weather, and the authority to move it did not reach that place. Later generations filled the gap with theories because the contemporary record ends before White could test his interpretation. Some proposals involve CROATOAN, others look toward mainland sites, death, dispersal, or combinations of movement. The colonists themselves had discussed division, so one fate for every person should not be assumed. The careful ending to White's search is not a solved mystery and not a blank. It is an interrupted investigation. He observed dismantling, a defensive enclosure, carved directions, and no agreed distress sign. Then a storm and the priorities of the voyage carried him away. Here is the detail to carry onward. Rain darkens the carved letters on the post. White stands close enough to trace them with his eyes. Beyond the enclosure lies the Sound, and farther south, the island named by the word. The boats are waiting, but the wind has already begun to decide for them. The ground at Roanoke has been asked to finish a story the written record could not. Archaeology has recovered meaningful parts of the English colonial attempts. Excavations near Fort Raleigh identified evidence of the 1585 scientific and metallurgical workshop, along with features associated with early occupation. Wells, furnace material, ceramics, and small objects reveal work performed in particular places. These finds make the colony less abstract. A workshop floor locates heat, tools, and repeated labor. A well locates the daily need for fresh water. A fragment of a vessel may identify manufacture or trade. Together, objects can establish activity without naming every person present. The shoreline complicates the search. Roanoke Island has changed through erosion, storms, deposition, construction, and later use. Parts of an early site may be underwater or destroyed. Other areas have been disturbed. A negative excavation means evidence was not found in the tested ground. it does not prove that no colonial activity ever occurred nearby. Researchers have also looked beyond Roanoke. A patch on one of John White's maps drew attention to a location inland near Albemarle Sound, sometimes called Site X. Excavations there produced a small number of objects consistent with the late 16th century English world in a native settlement context. The evidence is worth examining, but it cannot hold the entire colony. European objects could move through trade, salvage, gifts, or the travels of a few people. Context, quantity, date, and association all matter. Investigators themselves have cautioned that the site does not reveal a fort or a settlement large enough for the full 1,587 group. Work associated with CROATOAN on present-day Hatteras Island raises similar questions. European material at an indigenous site may reflect contact across several voyages and many forms of exchange. An object alone does not prove that its English owner lived there, joined a household, or remained for life. Identification becomes harder because colonists carried ordinary goods, not labels for future archaeologists. A buckle, ceramic fragment, gun part, or coin can be dated and compared. It seldom carries the name of the person who dropped it. Soil layers can be mixed by roots, storms, plowing, burrowing, and later occupation. This does not make archaeology futile. It makes its conclusions measured. A strong interpretation combines secure context, multiple objects, features, dating, documentary evidence, and comparison with surrounding sites. It remains open to revision when new evidence appears. The same care belongs to indigenous history. Carolina Algonquian communities did not exist merely to receive or reject the colonists. Their descendants endured disease, displacement, warfare, forced change, and later erasure from popular accounts. The absence of an English document does not mean the absence of indigenous memory or continuity. Roanoke's popular mystery often begins with a silent English clearing and ends with a carved word. Tonight we began earlier. The coast already held towns, fields, boats, alliances, and political decisions. English ventures entered that system carrying ambitions larger than their food stores and ships less suited to the water than local craft. The military colony damaged the relationships on which it depended. The family colony arrived at the wrong destination late in the growing season and asked its governor to seek supply. The settlers planned for movement and left a destination. White returned after war and privateering had turned months into years. He found evidence of relocation, then could not follow it. No supernatural event is required to explain why the record thins. Ordinary failures are sufficient. Delayed ships, damaged provisions, shallow water, political violence, disease, weather, competing priorities, and records preserved mainly by people who sailed away. What happened to each colonist remains uncertain. Some may have lived with or near CROATOAN. Some may have moved toward the mainland. Groups may have separated. People may have died at different times from different causes. The available evidence does not allow one fate to be assigned to all. Uncertainty is not an invitation to manufacture certainty. It is part of the archive. Return now to the shore before the English arrival. A narrow boat crosses the sound on known water. Smoke rises from a town beyond the trees. Fields wait above the wet ground. Nothing is missing from the landscape simply because an English page has not yet described it. Years later, another boat approaches an English clearing. Its passengers find cut timber, disturbed chests, and a direction left on a post. Their search ends, but the inhabited coast continues beyond their sight. Here is the last detail to carry with you. Evening settles over the sound. A channel bends between shoals, holding the reflection of the sky. On one side, waves soften an old shoreline. On the other, a path enters the trees. The ground keeps fragments, the water keeps moving, and the archive leaves room around what it cannot honestly name. The file returns to its shelf, the lamp stays on, and whenever you're ready, the archive will be here.